Good morning, all. If that's what this is, hard to tell anymore. So, for those of you who were, doing other things yesterday, the police officers, I don't know how far back I need to go here. I think pretty much anyone with a brain in America knows who Breonna Taylor is. But Breonna Taylor was a police officer in Louisville, Kentucky, for the Louisville Metro Police Department. And she was served a no-knock warrant on her home incorrectly. Essentially, there was a no-knock warrant served for a local drug dealer in the area. The police mistakenly, the police actually served the warrant, arrested the suspect, and he is incarcerated currently. Whereas Breonna Taylor was asleep in her bed after a day at work as a police officer when a no-knock warrant, which for those of you who don't know, basically means that the police have deemed you a dangerous enough threat to society that they can go to your home in plain clothes, break into it, and arrest you. They do not have to make themselves known. They do not have to knock. None of these things. And Breonna Taylor was mistakenly served this warrant at her home, and when the police entered her home in plain clothes, armed with weapons drawn, her boyfriend or husband, I'm not sure what their relationship was. I believe it was her boyfriend. Her boyfriend opened fire on the police, not knowing who they were and them having not announced themselves. And if I remember correctly, he was killed. He was at least shot, but I think he lived, to be honest, but I'll Google this while I'm telling you this story. So she was asleep. She was shot 5 times. Kenneth Walker fired a gun at the officers he believed to be intruders, who fired over 20 shots in return. It looks like he lived. Wow, I cannot spell today. Yeah, he is alive. So, she was shot 5 times while she was sleeping in her bed and was killed. There was absolutely no first aid or any sort of medical response for more than 20 minutes. And she died. She died. Since then, there has been an incredible amount of outcry pretty much across the country. She has been one of this case has been one of the shining examples of the fact that police are completely unaccountable in this country and can basically do whatever they want. And she has become sort of a battle cry for the Black Lives Matter movement, because that happened a long time ago. Let's see. Breonna Taylor. Yeah, March is when this happened. And this coincided very much with the beginning of the Black Lives Matter protests, with sort of coronavirus kicking off and just a whole lot of general unrest. And the 3 officers that responded to served the no-knock warrant were never charged up until yesterday. There was no charges. They were not investigated. There wasn't a big, huge freak out about the fact that this had happened. And, you know, this is the quintessential argument of the NRA, right? Putting someone in this position, right? Like, why have the NRA and your pro-Second Amendment groups if they aren't willing to use their massive, massive, massive platform? Because these people can reach millions and millions of gun owners. If they are not willing to use their platform to talk about literally the thesis of their beliefs, which is, if someone breaks into my home in the middle of the night and does not identify themselves, and I don't know who they are, then I'm going to shoot that person in order to protect myself and my family. And the fact that the Louisville Police Department created that situation, didn't already had the guy that they were trying to serve the warrant to, didn't identify themselves, and when he shot at them, they returned 20 shots and killed a police officer. While she was asleep in her bed. And if you're going to have institutions out there, cretinous institutions, heinous institutions, like the NRA, right? That have the membership of the NRA is tens of millions of legal gun owners in this country that claim to profess this idea of stand your ground laws and castle doctrines and all that bullshit that allows them to shoot people who break into their house, right? And protect theirs with, you know, their AR-15s and shit that they just have to have, right? And spends tens, hundreds of millions of dollars every year getting people elected to protect these so-called rights, and to and preaching about how we're going to make sure that people retain their Second Amendment freedom and their ability to protect themselves. The only thing that can protect people from a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun, right? Excuse me. And yet, Breonna Taylor, crickets. Philando Castile, who was killed in his car in front of his young child and his wife because he told the officer that he had a concealed handgun license and that his handgun was in the car. The officer got spooked. He asked Philando Castile to show him the weapon. Or the license, I can't remember. And Philando Castile reached for it, and he shot him, sitting in his car, in front of his child, who was in the back seat right here, in front of his wife in the passenger seat. These are agents of the state whose salaries that we pay that are murdering people and destroying families, relationships. I mean, for fuck's sake, the guy that his name is slipping my mind, but the guy that got shot in Milwaukee or Wisconsin or whatever, that is paralyzed now. He's going to be saddled with hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars worth of medical debt. His life will change forever. His experience in raising his own children, his experience in just going to the effing grocery store is going to change permanently for this man. His entire family has been traumatized. And this is happening every day. Every day. And people will come and tell you that they don't understand why the black family is not doing more. And why black fathers are not doing more, or whatever stupid argument they try to make about why there's this outbreak of crime and why black people are shooting each other and all this nonsense bullshit. They're being terrorized. I mean, imagine if that happened to somebody, you know, if you're like me and white and fairly okay in the grand scheme of society. Imagine that being your neighbor. That happening to your neighbor. You wouldn't be able to sleep at night. Imagine if you are asleep in your apartment and you were one of the people that a bullet came flying through the wall at 2 o'clock in the morning. You wouldn't be able to sleep. And these people live under these conditions systemically. Everywhere. Clearly. Because it's not like there's just been a rash of this shit in, you know, Minnesota. You know, it's not like George Floyd died and then every other high profile black person died within a 20-mile radius of there or whatever, and so it's a localized problem. No. This is a problem in Seattle. It's a problem in LA, where they shot the autistic kid. Completely unarmed autistic child sitting in the road. Of course, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor in Louisville. Philando Castile, I think, was in Louisiana. Sandra Bland in Texas. You have just an insane record in New York between Eric Garner and stop and frisk and all these insane racist policies. Not to mention the police union in New York is absolutely 100% full of nutbags. If you don't believe me, go on YouTube the Police Benefactor Society speech endorsing Trump. The guy's going on about how this is a war and we need to dominate the battle space and these people are insurgents. These are American citizens. These are American citizens. I don't, you know, there is no bar to clear on whether or not you should be treated well by the police. I'm sorry. We watched that clip the other day on the stream where, like, this is not how it works in the rest of the world. Most police departments aren't armed throughout the rest of the world. And if they are, it is a special division of their police department that only responds to certain calls, that is under an incredible amount of oversight. They are the most highly trained. I mean, this is not normal. This is not regular. There is nothing about this that is acceptable or that is part of running a free society. This is localized, culturalized fascism. I'm sorry. And so yesterday, about 1 o'clock, our time, it started kind of popping off on Twitter that Louisville, Kentucky was being put under lockdown. And the grand jury had been deliberating on this case because they were indicted several weeks ago. The 3 officers were indicted, and an investigation was opened, I think, a little over a month ago. And it could have been longer. My sense of time is terrible. Given that, you know, all time is blown out of whack. And it started popping off, trending or whatever on Twitter, that Louisville, Kentucky was being shut down, essentially. That they were closing places up, sending people home, very similar to, you know, I'm in the Dallas area, and very similar to us, where they were like, you know, we're going to close down businesses and institute a curfew, except they did it much earlier in the day, and kind of issued like a public safety warning. And so people just assumed that that meant that they were going to make the announcement on Breonna Taylor. And essentially, I think that the Louisville police understood that, like, even if they had charged all 3 police officers with first-degree murder and just thrown the book at them, there still would have been insanity. So they were locking down in precaution, regardless of. I don't think that they knew what the grand jury's decision was or whatever. So the grand jury decided to indict one of the three officers. The other two are free to go. The charges, or the charge that they are indicting this officer on, is a Class D felony. It called wanton endangerment, which is defined in the state of Kentucky as basically an act that basically doing something that endangers the lives of other people, even though you should know better. And so because this guy is a police officer, in theory, he should not have endangered other people's lives, knowing what could have happened by discharging his weapon, and yada yada yada. And so this ruling comes down, I think about 3 o'clock our time, yesterday, and by about 4 or 5 o'clock, the grand jury's decision has been released, read over by journalists, and kind of actually reported on. And people start to go, wait a minute, hold on. You're not charging him for wanton endangerment of Breonna Taylor's life, who is the one who ultimately died. You're charging him for wanton endangerment of the surrounding area. Because essentially the point that the grand jury makes in their argument is that, or in their decision, is that because he discharged his weapon so many times, bullets went into other apartments, and the general public was then endangered. Because other people. Whereas they were justified in firing their weapons within Breonna Taylor's apartment because they had been fired upon already. Even though they entered the apartment in plain clothes and did not knock. They broke into her home. They broke into her home. There is no other definition of breaking and entering that I know of, other than if a regular-looking person comes into my house without my permission while I'm sleeping. That is breaking and entering. I mean, these guys aren't Navy SEALs. They're not special forces. This is not Delta Force that we're dealing with here. Even if, I don't care if Breonna Taylor, I don't care if A, they were at the right house, and B, Breonna Taylor was Scarface. No-knock warrants are unconstitutional. They have to be. In any sort of regular, sane, just world, no-knock warrants would be unconstitutional and banned. For this exact reason. And I don't care if she's fucking Charles Manson. No American citizen should have fucking Delta Force kick in their front door in the middle of the night and murder them while they're sleeping without so much as a question asked or a conversation had. My wife and I recently sat down and watched the, well, not really recently, several weeks ago, and watched the miniseries on Netflix about Waco, right? And the compound there, essentially, that ended in just an insane amount of people dying. It was a horrific tragedy. I believe some police officers were shot also, maybe even killed. And basically it's like the quintessential like cult story, right? Cult standoff story. And basically what happened was that David Miscavige started this cult or whatever, where a bunch of people were living together in like very traditional, I don't know what you would call it, like kind of like village kind of way, where like very like first generation Christian type society, Pentecostal type folks, right? And they had bought into the idea that David Miscavige was, in direct communication with God, and that he had inside knowledge on becoming Armageddon, right? And so they had built a compound there that had like a school for their kids to go to and a hospital, and they had doctors and lawyers there, and they had basically built a free functioning society. Failures by the federal government to put down these sorts of cults or like compounds or whatever in the 90s. This was the 90s, I'm pretty sure. There had been several in a short period of time of local police departments and even the FBI dropping the ball on these like incest compounds and cults and like anti-government, white supremacist type people that hole up with multiple wives, and there's child abuse going on and all that kind of stuff, right? And so there was a big incentive within the law enforcement community to nail this, to get into Waco, cleanly break it up, arrest these people, get the children out, and make a big national story out of it. And if you don't know about this, that's okay, because I didn't either, and I live 200 miles from there. And I've lived here my whole life. And maybe that's just ignorance on my part. My understanding was that it was a crazy cult. The police showed up and there was a massive shootout and a bunch of people died. But watching this, now I want to be clear. It's fairly obvious that there was, at the very least, some domestic abuse going on within this compound. Not to mention, probably child sex crimes. I mean, David Miscavige married like a 14-year-old, I think. I mean, like, obviously, bad things going on, laws being broken. And that kind of helps to illustrate the point that I'm making. So, the FBI gets involved very early with Waco. And now, granted, I'm recounting the show to you. So, take this with a little bit of a grain of salt. But I have no reason to believe that the bold, like, story points are fabricated in some way. It seems to sound like the way that law enforcement would respond given the situation. So the FBI decides that they will do what they normally do with any sort of thing that they're trying to bust, which is they will infiltrate it. And they will have an undercover go in and try to move in across the street, essentially, from this compound, and try to befriend them so that they can get some information on them, figure out what they're doing, and then they can raid the place and quickly, quietly clean this thing up. Well, David Miscavige is a very, he was a smart person in that he understood that, like, that's what the FBI does. And so when somebody moved in across the street and started fucking asking questions, he was like, of course, this is a problem. Now, they were also sort of a death cult and stockpiling a shitload of illegal weapons. So the ATF was involved, the FBI is involved. And, telling this story is not me standing for David Miscavige and the Waco people at all. Clearly, there was illegal activity there. There is a place for law enforcement to get involved because that's their job. But what I'm saying is, they tried to infiltrate it, right? By covert means, and that blew up in their face. That did not work. So their secondary response was to, in the middle of broad daylight, right, roll tanks onto the property, tanks and armored personnel carriers onto the property, with scores and scores of heavily armed law enforcement jumping out of trucks and opening fire on the building. David Miscavige, now, this is a portion of the show that may have been dramatized, but I don't see how it could have been because David Miscavige was injured the entire time. David Miscavige was shot in this exchange. And because they had people inside that were, fairly medical trained or whatever and knew a little bit about what they were doing, they took care of him for several days while this standoff happened. But illegal activity, no illegal activity, right? No matter how you feel about the people of Waco, I think we've all decided as a society, illegal activity needed to be stopped. But the immediate escalation of, like, we're going to roll tanks onto your property because our spy didn't work. So we're going to roll hundreds of officers and military equipment onto your property and shoot you. Heavily armed cult that we know is a heavily armed cult. It's not like they didn't know that. That's the reason they're there. And the fact that they escalated that to such an extreme so immediately is exactly the problem. These people bitch about how, these people being police and our elected representatives, they bitch about how people are jittery and they're afraid and you don't know what they're going to do and they're unpredictable and blah 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 when they're having an exchange with a police officer. Well, of course. What do police officers do in this country? They fucking shoot people. That's what they do. Like, every show on TV is about it. Every news report that you turn on at night is about it. And if not, then you're a police officer who goes home and watches it from the other angle, which is, oh my god, cops are out there getting shot all the time. Holy shit. Cops are out there getting shot on TV shows. Cops are out there getting shot on the nightly news. Cops are out there getting shot in these protests. And so everybody on both sides is on a razor's edge, itchy trigger finger, ready to go all the time. So there were protests in Louisville and all across the country last night, which there should have been in this instance. And I just saw the headline to this, so I don't know a lot of the details, but apparently two police officers were shot and injured. I believe they're both still alive in the protests. And man, I mean, we are hurtling towards a moment of supreme conflict because people's grievances are not being redressed at all. What keeps, this is just historical context, right? What keeps people from overthrowing their government or being violent is that they make a decision in their head. They make a calculation in their head that government and leadership is worth keeping and worth obeying and worth respecting as an institution because it does more good for me than bad. It's just that simple. There was a study done, I can't remember when, but there was a study done about the colony sizes of different primates in the wild. And the most advanced primates, right? I mean, gorillas, bonobos, like these incredibly intelligent primates, they tap out at about 30, 35, 40 apes. Once a colony gets, or a troop or whatever, gets that large, they break off and have to live separately because you can't have the alpha male dynamic, but also there's just not enough resources to go around, and they're not advanced enough to be able to manage the resources and provide for many more primates than that. It's just sort of one of those unspoken natural laws. The number for humans is, I think, like 33. Or, no, I'm sorry, like 133. I could be off, give or take one or two. But the way that we got around that as a species is through organized government, which was able to allocate resources as necessary, and religion. Because if there isn't an alpha male that you can actively overthrow, and if your alpha male is, not to be cheap and crass, but invisible and not real in a material sense, then there is no struggle for dominance because everybody defers to religion or a religious figure. And so that's why you get the hierarchy that you do in societies prior to the modern era, which is, God runs the place, and then maybe you have a king or a pope or something like that that is able to directly communicate with God, but ultimately God runs the show and we rotate out the number 2 guy, right? And people stick with their governments as long as 2 things are fulfilled. One, there is some sort of divine explanation, and by divine I don't necessarily mean religious, but some sort of governing principle that allows people in their own mind to reconcile what they're seeing around them. So, for instance, a couple of streams ago we talked about how in America, that is the American dream. And that is the idea of if I work hard I can make it. Right? And not only if I work hard I can make it, but if I work hard then I am virtuous. And virtue is rewarded in our society just intrinsically, right? So if you can maintain either some sort of divine power, a god that is directly involved in government, which was the case, several hundred years ago or whatever. And you could argue even now, because a lot of the right wing is very much about the Constitution was handed down by God or whatever. And there is a little bit of a divine meaning that goes into that because Republicans understand that dynamic. And you need to assure people that government is more of a value to them than a detriment. Now, if you throw out the first one, revolution is imminent because people stop believing the story very quickly, it doesn't make sense, and then they have to change things to make them make sense in their own mind. But the second one, the idea of government that does better for me than it does worse, or that I'm better off with government than I am without it, if that erodes and it becomes the case that you are worse off from government than you are better, that can take a lot of time. That can take a lot of time to motivate people to get rid of a system because there's a lot at stake, right? I can't go overthrowing the government. I make $7 an hour. I can't go overthrow the government. My kid's sick. And so as long as you can make the story make sense, the big overarching divine story, which again in this case is the American dream, then you can allow for the government to shaft you a little bit here and there. Because it's not worth rocking the boat of your own life and throwing yourself overboard just because you feel like you individually are being inconvenienced. Because the reality is we don't have collectivism in our society. That we are very isolated from one another. Right? This is why direct action by the left is very hard to organize. And so there is no feeling of camaraderie in the suffering that our system imposes on people, or there is very little, because there are no unions. The church is a very isolated echo chamber that is mostly filled with right-wingers now. And church is mostly for, if you do find that in the church, great, that does happen, but church on the whole is mostly for upper middle class people at this point. Now you might go to a small church, and in that case then yes, you probably are finding that camaraderie, but it is within American exceptionalism to not admit it to each other. So you're all just sitting around being like, everything's fine. It's polite or whatever. I've been on here a while, my coffee's getting cold. So what was I saying? Oh yeah. So the story, when that feeling of my government is doing better for me than I am for it starts to go away, people can live like that for a long time. And I would make the argument that that started to become the case in the early 80s. I think people realized that okay, we just elected this guy who was an insanely popular person in Reagan, and he is all about rugged individualism, and he's gonna make it to where you can excel if you really believe in the American dream. And then Reagan cut taxes, and Reagan destroyed the country essentially. And ever since then, it has been a pendulum just swinging insanely back and forth for most regular people. You're completely screwed for 4 8 years. Then it swings back and you're all right for 4 8 years, and then it swings back and you're completely screwed. And normal people can't live like that. And that takes a very corrosive, that has a very corrosive effect on the social fabric of the country and on people being able to understand what's going on around them. And so now you are seeing an acceleration of people who are just like, look, I'm fed up. My government is unresponsive. I mean, there will be no more coronavirus relief for people. It's not going to happen. They passed the government shutdown continuing resolution yesterday. It's over. There will not be any more coronavirus relief. Not for localities, not for landlords, not for renters, not for hospitals, states, local health departments, public health clinics. None of that. It's not coming. The Senate is going to use every bit of its political capital for the next 40-something days, however long it is. 5 weeks, 5 days, 40 days. That they're going to use every bit of political capital that they have to do their Supreme Court shit. And there will be no more relief for people. Unemployment has expired. And the subsequent FEMA money that was supposed to subsidize that, it has been long gone. We are sitting on a bubble of commercial real estate that has not been paid for because of the coronavirus. New constructions, retail establishments that haven't been paying their rent and their leases and stuff because they haven't been making any money. That sort of stuff is going to burst at some point. And there is no relief coming. So people look at this and they recognize that their government is unresponsive to the public. And that's because those two things are so closely interlinked. Because in order for you to believe, if I work hard, I am virtuous, and if I am virtuous, I will make it, you know, the American dream, you also have to believe that America as an institution is somehow backstopping that, is somehow making that the case, is somehow ensuring that we find this virtue in people and bestow society's resources upon them. That's part of the story that you have to buy. And as the story is falling apart for people, or as the idea of government being able to do that is falling apart for people, so goes the story. So goes the American dream mythos. And because people are at home, mostly alone and afraid, and their lives have been upended, maybe they're, with their kids all day now and trying to parent, work, pay the bills, teach, and just kind of hold everything together, all the while not getting sick, and all the while not getting somebody that they love who might be immunocompromised in some way or something like that sick. And people are, the mortality rate in this country is going, or the age of mortality in this country, average age of mortality, being how long our citizens live, is going down in this country because of deaths of despair. That's people drinking themselves to death, eating themselves to death, drug overdoses. Because there is no, there is no medical institution to take care of those people. We don't have robust mental health care in this country. For a country that leads the world in mental health problems, we don't have mental health care for people to access. And we ask people to compartmentalize their daily existence of just being miserable. You know, you go to work at a job that you hate to make money that's not enough, to stress out about bills you can't pay, to have no money in savings, to just wait for your car to break down and then you're fucked, or get a flat tire and you're fucked, or your kid gets sick and you're fucked, or you get sick and you got to miss a couple of days work and you're fucked. And we ask people to live under these conditions and then compartmentalize all that away in a little box over here. And then when something horrific happens in society, like this Breonna Taylor thing, or like coronavirus, or whatever, we ask people to put that shit in a nice little box and leave it over there and be civil with our leadership. And be civil with the armed representation of the bourgeois. You know, that the ruling class. To be civil with these people. To put all that little shit in a box, lock it up real tight, and then come over here and have a polite conversation with the people who we elected to fix all of these problems that are in the little box. It's an insane way to run a society. And you wonder why people are losing it. You wonder why people are out in the street, burning shit down. And you can write that off if you'd like. As like, well, that's just Antifa. That's just Antifa, and they're just a bunch of thugs. Okay. Deny that to your own peril, buddy. Because, sure, maybe, let's allow for your insane excuse of that it's just Antifa. Okay, fine. Let's say 50% of the people out there protesting and painting shit and burning shit and assaulting people are Antifa thugs sent by China or whatever, right? What about the other 50%? What about your normal ass nephew or whatever that's going out to the protests? What about the moms in Seattle, the hundreds of moms, these middle-aged white women that have literally had to put gas masks and protective equipment on and stand in a line between the protesters and the police because they're the only people that won't get gassed, even though they're gassing them. They started gassing them a couple weeks ago. You know, like, deny this to your own peril. You are creating these circumstances for people to no longer want their government, to no longer want to function as a regular society. And with all of that wrapped up in a nice little unrest package, we are hurtling full speed towards a unprecedented election contesting effort that is going to go on, no matter who wins. Because if Trump wins, right, which I am a believer in the theory that Trump will have won on election night, and he will have won bigly. He will have a big lead on election night because the mail-in ballots take forever to count. There's legal implications. Damn, there's a fly in here. There's legal implications to the fact that some ballots in some states you can't count. Damn, there's really a fly in here. In some states you can't count mail-in ballots until election day, and there's going to be millions of those, so it's going to take some time. We could be looking at 2 or 3 weeks before we get the actual real live result of what happened in the election. So you've got Trump, who is going to react on election night because all he knows is what America looks like through his television screen, as like, look, I destroyed Joe Biden. 15% of the votes in, and I'm up 430 to 108 or whatever. So everybody stop counting. I won. We don't need to put the country through this. Let's get back to work. Or he's going to say, okay, listen, everybody keep counting, except like you guys in Florida and Pennsylvania, and maybe like more specifically Philadelphia. Like, you guys specifically stop counting. And then you're going to have the Democrats with their hair on fire and the media with their hair on fire. And you are going to have Trump, who is the king of double and triple and quadrupling down, who's just going to be like, no, I won. No, I won. No, I won. No, I won. Because he never is ever, I mean, when has he ever been like, oh, yeah, no, upon visiting further evidence. Whoops, got that one wrong. Never. Never, ever, ever. And then if Biden wins, right, you're going to have Trump, who has already said, it's the biggest hoax. It's the biggest hoax, people. The entire election is a hoax. It's all fake ballots. They're fake ballots. And you're going to have 30% of the country that buys that shit. And is like, oh yeah, hoax election. And guess what? Those 30% of Americans, super duper armed. And super duper willing to like go out with these militia nut jobs and counter protest. Or protest and then get counter protested. And with the undergirding, the underlying unrest that is going on surrounding every other facet of society that we just talked about, to add election chaos on top of that, you know, I'm a believer that, I don't know if this is naive of me, I don't know if this is optimistic of me, perhaps, but I'm a believer that the institutions will hold. I'm pretty sure that the institutions will hold. That we're going to have several weeks of chaos, but eventually the votes will have come back, right? All the mail-in votes are counted. You know, it may be December before this is the case, first week of December, something before this is the case, but all of the votes will have been counted. Joe Biden will have won by several million votes in the popular vote. Plus, he, you know, depending on how Philadelphia and Florida go, he will probably have won the Electoral College once everything is counted. That's just what the polls look like right now if the election were held today, right? And before you hit me with the whole, polls are always wrong. Okay, yeah, but the amount that they were wrong by in the Hillary-Trump thing is still less than Joe Biden's lead. It's close, but it's still less than Joe Biden's lead. So even if they flip the same way that they did in 2016, Joe Biden still wins. And I think that at the end of the day, everybody is going to look at that. Even, you know, yes, you might have 15, 20% of the country who are lost anyway. Yeah, they might go like, well, I still don't believe it, right? But that's not enough people to sway public policy in the election, right? Whereas most normal people are going to go like, oh, okay, I understand the dynamics. Somebody explain this to me. And because you got to remember, most people aren't politically involved. Somebody explained this dynamic to me. It took longer to count the votes. I understand what's going on. So, of course, Joe Biden's president. And there's not going to be a military coup or anything to install Joe Biden or to get rid of Trump. Like, that's not going to happen. Right? Like, Trump's a complete, he's a blowhard. Everybody knows this. Even right-wingers say this about him. His bark is worse than his bite. He's not going to chain himself to the Resolute desk or something. Eventually, he'll just be like, you know, eventually the Secret Service will come and knock, you know, third week of January and be like, sir, do you need some help packing your shit? And he'll just be like, well, I guess, okay. And just go get his shit. And get out. Now, he'll be an asshole about it, and he'll start a news channel about how the radical left is taking over the country or whatever. But I think that the institutions will ultimately hold. Now, you're going to have a much deeper rift in the voting population in the society because you're going to have a lot of people pissed off that, you know, in their eyes, Trump is getting screwed. I'm not saying that's not going to happen. I'm just saying that, like, just from a purely presidential standpoint, just from a purely, like, what is going to happen to the election type thing, if you're just looking at it from that, then the actual vote in its wonky way that it does in America will determine the election. Now, we could still have Donald Trump lose the popular vote, but win the electoral college, and he's president, and I think that's bullshit, but that's the system, and that's no one did anything about it for the last 4 years. So Democrats have no one to blame but themselves for not making that a bigger issue. If that happens again. So I just think that, like, you are fanning a flame that societal conditions and the socioeconomic conditions of regular people are already adding gasoline to. You know, you can make the argument that America was eventually going to have some sort of mass social unrest that was going to lead us to, you know, revolutionary conditions at some point, whether that was exacerbated by extreme climate change or just insane wealth transfer or whatever. You can make the argument that revolution is inevitable, and so it was going to happen eventually. But you have a lot of unprecedented historical insanity going on right now in the world, and people are unable to process it in a meaningful way. And you have also spent the last 20 to 30 years telling young people that if you don't like the world, go out and change it. In some sort of, like, in every bit of their pop culture, in every bit of their historical context. You know, eventually teaching that America is exceptional because of our revolutionaries, eventually that comes back to bite you as a ruling class. Yeah, sure, it works for a while, but then people go, wait, hold on. I can connect these dots here. I'm Paul Revere. You guys are King George. You know, like, or hold on, you're General Custer and I'm Sitting Bull, and this is a problem. Like, that type of stuff starts to ingrain itself in people's head, and they recognize the conditions for I don't know, for lack of a better term, overthrowing their system. So I would say go vote early. Get your voting done. You have the ability to do so. About a week before the election, hit the grocery store, do all the chores you need to do, run all the errands that you need to do, and then be safe, but be brave. Don't be gaslit. There already is massive effort to gaslight people into thinking that they're crazy for wanting their government to materially provide for them. And the fact of the matter is, you pay taxes. You pay taxes to this government. A considerable amount. You know, we can talk about the morality. We can talk about the individual, like, devoutness of people. The commitment to progressive policies or whatever the hell. You can have those arguments elsewhere. The argument that I'm having right now applies to everybody. You pay 20, 30, 35% of the money that you are supposed to bring home to your family to this government. And this government takes that money and launders it to a bunch of rich assholes, buys weapons to pay your kid $18,000 a year to go overseas and shoot brown people, or bomb brown people, or sit in a room in Kansas and fly drones over there and kill people at their weddings. Your government takes your money and subsidizes private health care that is getting rich off of you getting sick instead of providing it. Your government takes your money and allows universities in this country to raise their tuition thousands of percentage points over what they were in the 70s, 80s, and 90s in order to make a profit, to subsidize enormous football programs and enormous arts programs and ridiculous bonuses and bullshit for university presidents. Your government takes your money and spends it on nonsense. Planes that we don't need. $10,000 hammers. Instead of rebuilding the road that you drive down every day, which is destroying the car that you pay for and have to pay to repair. Or instead of providing you with public transport where you live so that you don't have to own a car and people don't have to own cars en masse and destroy the environment, and you can cheaply and easily get from your home to your work through public transport, or even more efficient infrastructure so that you driving there is not such a hassle. Your government takes your money and refuses to regulate these businesses who are dumping toxic shit in our water, who are running prisons that are doing unauthorized hysterectomies on immigrants. Your government takes your money and relocates, takes children, 2, 3, 4-year-old children away from their parents at the border and plays shuffle game with them. There are thousands of these kids that will never be reunited with their parents and are sitting in a cage being taken care of by 8-year-old girls. This is not specific to a political party or a president or a left-right affiliation. Your government takes your money and says we're going to spend $1 billion on making sure that we have a stockpile of personal protective equipment in case, because it is a national security risk, in case we have a pandemic breakout and doctors and nurses and other healthcare professionals need to have personal protective equipment available to them because it is a national security issue. They take your money, and instead of spending that $1 billion on that, they spend it on planes. That was a story yesterday, or 2 days ago, that the Pentagon laundered that money, said it was for something, and spent it on weapons of war. Your government takes your money and then cuts programs for for children who are food insecure or need health care. Your government takes your money and regulates abortion in many states in this country to the point where women cannot get adequate health care, even if they're not getting an abortion, even if they're just low income and they're trying to get the pill or a breast exam or just basic health care. Your government takes your money and then defunds public schools in the name of certificates so that you can go to a fancy charter school. Democrat, Republican, Independent, okay. Your government is stealing from you, and failing to provide the circumstances where you would be even a little bit okay with this. I'm sorry, man. It is a broken system. And the idea that people in charge, the Chuck Schumer, Mitch McConnell, Nancy Pelosi, Donald Trump, uh, take your pick, at the federal level, are just sitting there like the gasp emoji that we're all upset is absurd. And it insults people's intelligence. And the fact is, the only way to solve this problem, Big D Democrats, the Joe Biden and Kamala Harris bunch, will tell you that the way to solve this problem is to register to vote and then go vote. And I will tell you that that is not your only responsibility. Your responsibility as a citizen and as a member of this society is to educate yourself and pay attention to what our government is doing, to who is running for office, to what they stand for, to the policy solutions, to the problems of the people around you. Maybe not even just you, but the people around you. To fight for something, to fight for someone that you do not know. That is your job as an American citizen. You don't have to knock doors. You don't have to phone bank. You don't have to, hold a big rally. You don't have to organize workers at your job. That's all for people who really care about this shit and really have the, heart for it and want to do it. But your job as an American citizen is to know the difference. Your job as an American citizen is to be an educated voter. Not just sit on Facebook and make your decisions that way, but to be an educated voter. Yes, it is on Democrats and Republicans to advocate for policies that get people excited about voting and that activate people politically. That is true. But if you don't know the difference between the person who is primarying your senator and your senator, who is that on? Because they're making the distinction. It's not like they're running an election and not saying anything. These people are making a distinction. There is a clear distinction. And you might say, well, Kyle, I don't have time to pay attention who's going to be the head of my school board and who's going to be my mayor. Okay, fine. But you don't have time to know who your House rep is on the federal level? You don't have time to figure out who your senator is? Figure out who they're running against? Figure out if you support that person more or less than the incumbent? And give a little money to that campaign? You don't have time to recognize that the Supreme Court and the changes that a new Supreme Court nominee will make to the fabric of the law in society is insanely important. I'm sorry. You live in this society. You benefit from other people's tax dollars in one way or another. Maybe you're rich and you only benefit from it in the postal service and roads. Okay, cool. You still owe us being active in society and being an educated voter. And that means more than knowing the issues. You have to know the people and what they stand for and how you're going to hold them accountable. I'm sorry, man. There's blame to go around everywhere. Yes, there has been a dramatic failure for government to respond to the needs of regular people. And there has been a dramatic failure for government to even speak to people's needs, to even understand the material conditions that they are providing for people aren't working. Yes, that's true. But at a certain point, right? We can't go back to, we can't go back to brunch. I hate to keep saying that on every stream, but we can't. It's going to take a certain amount of political activism to move people. All of my lefty-ish people will tell me that, like, well, we got to elect Joe Biden and then we can move him. How? How? How are you going to push him? What political leverage are you going to use? How are you going to strategically get what you want? Because while you're not doing that, the Republicans are. While you're not doing that, the people who you say you don't like, that support Trump, are doing it. They are figuring out how they're going to beat you even if Joe Biden wins. They already have a plan. The blame goes all around. Rest in power, Breonna Taylor. See y'all tomorrow.